Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Business Ethics. In this video, we are going to be talking about some rather ancient, you might say, ethical theories, in particular, two different theories of virtue ethics, one proposed by Aristotle and another proposed by Confucius. All right, so let's get started. All right, so a general overview of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to start off talking about Aristotelian virtue ethics, so virtue ethics that were proposed by Aristotle in ancient Greece. And then a couple hundred years prior to that, we're going to talk about Confucius's virtue ethics that he proposed. And then we're going to talk about some similarities and differences and the implications that those similarities and differences have on contemporary business ethics today. All right, so just to give you a little bit of background on Aristotle. So his ethics were derived from what he took to be this very special thing about humans, namely their ability to exercise reason and deliberate, meaning think through things. It's sort of a way of applying reason, right? And he focused on those abilities to sort of make sense of the natural world and help Greek philosophers such as himself identify humanity's purpose in that natural world. So for Aristotle, determining the purpose of anything was something that we figured out by looking at something's function and its form. So everything that exists, or he assumed rather, everything that exists has a purpose. And he thought that that purpose is a function. Or rather that purpose defined a function. Okay, so that sounds all fine and good. What does that actually mean, these words, purpose and function? Well, one way to think about it, common example often brought up, is we think about a table or a chair. The purpose of a table or a chair, right? Tables put stuff on them. Maybe a chair is even a little bit simpler. The purpose of a chair is for us to sit on it. And thus what dictated what a good chair would be, or rather what the purpose of a chair would be something that is that you sit on. And then a good chair would be one that was very comfortable to sit on. It really satisfied its purpose. So we can pretty easily think about a bunch of different examples of various objects in the world, right? Where we think about, what it is, what it's meant to do, and based off of its form, observations about its form, and then from there we can identify what it is to be that thing well, sort of be the thing that it was, we might say, intended to be to the best of its abilities. Okay. Now, how does this work for humans, right? So first and foremost, Aristotle, like I mentioned just a moment ago, felt that humans have this very special ability to practice reason, or one might say to deliberate. And when we think of deliberation in this context, we might want to imagine, say, a jury who is reviewing all of the evidence, making its verdict, right? So you have a group of people that are looking over the evidence, they're looking over the arguments that were made by the lawyers and this sort of thing. And they deliberate it to determine whether or not the person accused of whatever crime is actually guilty of that crime. So that process, that kind of evaluation, is the sort of deliberation that we're talking about here with Aristotle. So, so when we deliberate well, when we exercise this capacity to reason well, this thing that makes us special, we look at that thing, that feature of us that makes us so special. Aristotle felt, that there was nothing else in the natural world, at least that he witnessed, that had that ability to deliberate in the ways that I just described, say the jury deliberated. So we have this special thing about us, just like the chair is sort of special in that it's like the thing that you sit on, right? Humans are special in that they can exercise this capacity to reason. And when we do that well, Aristotle felt that we experience what he called eudaimonia. So eudaimonia in the textbook, I noticed, and this is something that, any Googling that you're going to do, you're going to see this more often than not, is defined as happiness. And because Aristotle was writing in ancient Greek, right? Writing in this ancient language, not even to mention the fact that, his works were subsequently translated in other languages. Exactly what he meant by this term, eudaimonia, doesn't necessarily match this contemporary understanding of what the word happiness means. For all intents and purposes, it gets at some of it, but it's best, I think, to understand this notion more in terms of like the sense of satisfaction that you would get doing the thing that you're put here to do well. So you might want to take a moment, maybe even pause the video and just imagine a situation, some situation you might find yourself in. There's some skill set, something you've worked to accomplish, say maybe even just doing well in a class, or at a job, or learning how to skateboard, or singing, dancing, something like this, a skill that you've worked really hard to develop in yourself, something that you've worked hard to do. I mean, even driving, say, learning how to drive or drive well, speaking another language, learning how to do that well. So with that idea in mind, with those, try to identify the thing for yourself that you've worked really hard to do, this experience you've had of that. Now think about the kind of feeling you got when you achieved some kind of success, whether that's, you were able to have a conversation easily in this other language that you worked really hard to learn how to speak, or you ended up getting an A in that class, or you performed with a dance troupe in front of a large audience and everyone really loved the performance, something like this. So imagine that moment, imagine that feeling. And clearly, that is a kind of happiness, but it's a very specific kind of happiness, right? So it's that sense, that feeling that Aristotle was talking about. And that's a feeling he thought we would get, just any human, by virtue of exercising this capacity to reason well. Okay. So to sort of clean up some of the thinking on this, or to sort of summarize some of the ideas I've talked about here, maybe frame them in a different way if you're feeling a little confused, I'm going to have us watch this video.
I'm Chris Serpernot, and I teach in the Department of Philosophy at the University of New Orleans. This video is part of my series on human well-being and the good life, and it examines Aristotle's account of well-being as presented in the Nicomachean Ethics and Politics. At the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle aims to identify the highest good for human beings. While most people believe that the highest good is the acquisition of material wealth, pursuit of honor, or satisfaction of bodily pleasure, Aristotle argues that all of these goods are deficient as the highest good in some way. Material wealth is always acquired for the purpose of attaining something else. Pursuing honor is not connected to any characteristic of the person himself, but how others perceive him. And satisfying bodily pleasures is not a good peculiar to human beings. Here, Aristotle gives us insight into an important component of the highest good. It must be something that is consistent with the maximization of our faculties as human beings. What separates human beings from non-human animals is our capacity for reason, and a life that aims only at satisfying bodily pleasures is one Aristotle claims is not fit for human beings, but for cattle. And so he argues that a good life for human being would focus to a significant extent on contemplation and learning, or acquiring the intellectual virtues. Aristotle associates the intellectual virtues with what we might identify as scientific knowledge. Here, there are two kinds of knowledge: knowledge of first principles or fundamental truths of nature, and knowledge that comes from inference or demonstration, or what comes about as the result of applying these principles. But spending your life in contemplation alone is not enough. Aristotle claims that the person who lives a good life also acts rightly and develops the appropriate state of character from which to perform those right actions. While the intellectual virtues are acquired as a result of learning, these character virtues, such as courage, temperance, and generosity, are acquired as the result of habituation and life experience. These virtues occupy a middle ground between the vices of excess and deficiency relative to each person. So, for example, the virtue of courage occupies a middle ground between being cowardly and being overly rash. Acquisition of both the intellectual virtues and these virtues of character make up Aristotle's highest good, which he identifies with the Greek word eudaimonia, which in translations of Aristotle often is translated as the word happiness. While a person achieves eudaimonia when he possesses all of the virtues, acquiring some of these virtues requires more than studying or the right amount of habituation. Certain external conditions must be present for their cultivation, external conditions that are often beyond the control of individuals. Perhaps the most important is that an individual is born into the right type of state. Aristotle argues that the state exists not for the purpose of allowing people to live, but for the purpose of allowing them to live well. And he also claims that one aim of the legislators is to make use of the laws to help improve the character of individuals. Individual character develops along a spectrum of worse to better, a spectrum that ranges from vicious to virtuous, with incontinent and continent falling in between. What connects all of these character states is that these individuals possess reason and know the difference between good and bad behavior. The vicious man is the worst. He derives pleasure from acting badly. The incontinent man is next. He is inclined to act wrongly and gives in to these inclinations out of weakness. And so while he has satisfied his desires, he is dissatisfied with himself in the same way that we are dissatisfied with ourselves when we look back on our own moments of weakness. The continent man possesses strength of will, and unlike the incontinent man, acts rightly even though he was inclined to do what was wrong. But he is not fully satisfied either because he was not able to satisfy his inclinations. Aristotle's virtuous man is able to satisfy both his inclinations and his rational desires because these two things are aligned. He wants to do what is right and does it, and as a result, derives pleasure from good behavior. Aristotle argues that one function of the well-ordered state is to help individuals make this progression from worse to better. Laws are able to habituate people to perform the correct actions, and so doing what is right becomes habit over time, and individuals acquire an affinity for this kind of good behavior. It is for this reason that Aristotle argues that a legislator must possess the intellectual virtue of phronesis, which is connected to understanding what constitutes virtuous and vicious behavior and knowing how to direct people to do what is right. So for Aristotle, a human lives well when he acts rightly and possesses all of the virtues, both intellectual and those relating to good character. But some elements of a good life are not completely within a person's control. While Aristotle's observations here may be correct, they also allow us to raise issues in the area of social justice and ask what obligations we have to people who are less fortunate in order to help them live as well as possible.
All right. So there are a couple of things that a couple of points that video made that that I just want to reiterate. First and foremost, this ability to deliberate, this thing that, if we do it well, then we can reach this eudaimonia, or eudaimonia, however which way you would like to pronounce it. But the way that we reach this state, this virtuous state where we're really doing our function well, right, is that through this process of deliberation. And in the abstract, that might be all fine and good. And what the video is pointing out is the way that we have to learn to excel in this capacity by application, right? So when the person, the guy in the video was talking about, finding this place between these two extremes, right? Between say cowardliness and like bloodthirst, right? We have courage. Being able to determine in the moment, case by case, where that middle ground is, where that middle ground between whatever excess and or whatever excess and deficiency, that is, the more we develop this skill in being able to find that middle ground, the better we become at exercising this extra special human feature of ourselves, this capacity to reason. So it's, for Aristotle, the emphasis, and this is something that we're going to talk a little bit about with Confucius as well, but the emphasis on practice is really a crucial piece there, because it's through this deliberation that we habituate ourselves, right? So at the end of the video, and this is the second point that I wanted to touch on, at the end of the video, they were talking about how we can develop certain habits to where we're just all of a sudden attracted to the thing that is good, right? And so, I noticed that quite a few of you have expressed some interest in psychology and things like this. So this is a really interesting place where, even the ancient Greeks were thinking about these features of human psychology, right? Recognizing that we get into patterns, we have habits with certain things. And upon recognition of that, about this feature of our psychology, right? Aristotle saw an opportunity for us to teach ourselves, condition ourselves to be virtuous people. So maybe, in the beginning, someone is saying, okay, well, I am looking for this mean because this is what Aristotle told me to do, right? So like going, about your day-to-day life, trying to determine what the right thing to do is, well, Aristotle said I should do it, so I should be like looking for this mean, and like, all right, so I'm thinking about like, what does this thing look like in excess? What does it look like in deficiency? Where's the middle ground here? Say, somebody is gossiping about your family, right? So like, how do you address this gossip? These false and defamatory bits of gossip going around about your family. What's the right thing to do there, right? Okay, so what would Aristotle say I should do? All right, I need to like think about this, find the middle ground, and ultimately the action that person takes, they might sort of stumble on the right thing to do. Just by virtue of stumbling upon the right thing to do doesn't necessarily make you a virtuous person in Aristotle's mind, because to be a virtuous person, you just have to be naturally attracted. It's like you barely even have to deliberate. You've gotten so good at playing this game of like, okay, this is a tough situation. What's the overreaction? What's the underreaction? Where's the middle ground? That sort of thing. By practicing that, you'll just eventually find yourself attracted to that mean, that behavior in the middle. That's the right way to behave. And so it's that kind of person that's attracted to the good things, the things that they have determined, sort of conditioned themselves to be attracted to by exercising this capacity to reason. It's that process. It's a long process, right? That makes someone a virtuous person. So it's all about character. And this is something that the textbook emphasized, and you see a lot emphasized in, writings about Aristotle, writings in Aristotle, and things like this, is that it's all focused on the kind of person you are, not necessarily just whether or not your actions are good. So we are going to move on now to a little bit of a closer discussion of Aristotle's virtue ethics, and then we'll start thinking more and talking more about how this applies in a civic context, right, and like in a political context, as well as in contemporary business. So, all right. So, like it was discussed in the video, Aristotle felt that wealth can't be, when it comes to business, right? When it comes to our business transactions, wealth can't be the good in and of itself, because it only serves as a means always for getting something else, right? If you think about it. And I think that that's still in many ways is true now. I mean, at the very least, maybe wealth or even just having money is a means for providing comfort and a sense of safety, right? It's not an ends, Aristotle felt, in and of itself. So because of this obvious truth, Aristotle argued that business necessarily requires we rise above this obsession with the baser instincts, like the instincts for comfort, perhaps even luxury, right? And perhaps or rather, so we're thinking about, this attraction to money, wanting to engage in business, all of that stuff. And, sort of just recalling the stuff that I was talking about, trying to practice being this, good reasoner, this ability to exercise reason, and going through the different decisions in your day to day, and, making these evaluations, trying to find the middle ground between excess and deficiency, right? So when it comes to these business transactions, what we want to be thinking about there is, this pull, this really strong pull we often have towards greed. So, assuming that, someone isn't on the other side of the scale, what you could imagine would be something sort of like someone that completely deprives themselves of any comfort or safety, and as a result, sort of sits like not wanting to do any kind of work, anything like this. And obviously, if you just sat and didn't do anything, it probably wouldn't end well, right? Getting up, going to get food, drink water, things like this. That wouldn't be any good. But we're not really pulled in that direction, so we don't have to think about it in that way. For the most part, we can imagine conditions where maybe a person would be. But in general, when it comes to business, we don't have to worry about people engaging in business being pulled in that direction, right? The direction that we have to worry about them being pulled towards is this greed, right? This giving in to the baser instincts. And one of the reasons why Aristotle felt giving into that greed, going in that direction, was really, really, really problematic, was really bad, is because it creates scandal. So again, maybe you might want to pause the video for a moment, or at the very least, just think about an example where a business has got you, like a recent example where a business has gotten caught up in some kind of scandal, right? Some kind of insider trading, lying to the public, something like this, right? And in Aristotle's mind, what that did was it, being in the public sphere like that, the public witnessing that, those kinds of these stories that go viral about these companies doing bad sorts of things, that really tips the scale of justice. People out there, public figures with bad reputations, is really, Aristotle felt, bad for society on the whole. Just feeling like the system could be that broken is a huge problem in Aristotle's mind. So what would constitute civic virtue would be not only someone who is, making an effort to find that that middle ground when it comes to, say, maybe like being lazy and then, being ultra greedy. Doing that in the public sphere, in the public eye, is a way someone who's able to find that point well, or is able to identify that point. Not only is that good on sort of this individual level, but it presents it presents you to the public as having honorable associations. So something that is really important for this discussion of business, about business, and this is something that the text went into in pretty great detail, is that businesses don't exist in isolation. They sort of exist as a result of the state, right? Of the government. And this, this is something that I talked about in the first introductory video. Businesses don't operate in a vacuum, and Aristotle saw this. And as a result, he felt that there are certain considerations that need to be taken into account when we're talking about what constitutes virtuous behavior in business. Maybe a virtuous business person needs to be mindful of associations with the communities in which they exist. Now, this is definitely true for individuals as well, but there's something that is a little bit special about those who engage in business, because of the visibility and because of the potential to sort of exploit those systems that they exist within for their own benefit. So it's important that you maintain a good and honorable association, because doing so has a direct impact on sort of the moral health of the society in which you exist. It goes hand in hand. Now, mind you, this is a sort of moral obligation that arises based off of what it is to be a good person, individually to be a good person. So in Aristotle's mind, you start off with the individual who's learning how not to behave rashly or greedily, or things like this, right? You look at all the options available in any given situation and you deliberate over them. You find that mean, that middle ground between excess and deficiency. And an honorable person is someone who is prudent. That is, they have honorable associations, and are only interested in self-advancement, provided that they do not injure their personal integrity, reputation, or the body politic, right? So again, you start off with the individual, and identify what it is, what eudaimonia looks like for the individual. And then you kind of project that out into a larger context and see, hey, this bad reputation type behavior is not only, keeping you from exercising your purpose, for being the thing that, that you're sort of put here to be. It's also something that is harming the moral integrity of the community in which you live. So that's Aristotle's thinking on it. With that emphasis on the individual in mind, we're going to move to another philosopher who started from a very different point. And this philosopher is Confucius. So we're first going to just talk a little bit about Confucius's virtue ethics, and then we'll move on to how that might apply in a business setting. All right. So for Confucius, the practice of virtue consisted in the essence of governance, right? So whereas for Aristotle, who showed how a self-determining person might live well in society, Confucius argued that that relationship determining people live well with others. So for Confucius, he started with the relationships in which you exist within, right? So we'll cover this a little bit, or this is going to be covered a little bit shortly in another video clip that we're going to watch. But we're not going to go into it in too much detail. There were hierarchies in relationships, right? So it wasn't just, okay, so, your relationship with your parent, and then also with your governor, with your government, or in this case, I think it was the emperor, things like this, like that's all just like one big relationship. And you need to take it into account. There was a hierarchy. There were levels of varying importance to which you needed to attend depending on certain ties connected with loyalty in particular family. But for right now, you can just think about it in terms of Aristotle starting off defining all of these things, like what it would be good, all of that, just based off of what an individual person was sort of put on earth to do well, versus Confucius, who started off with the idea of these relationships and how it is we make these relationships function well that give rise to how people should act. So it wasn't the individual, it was relationship with one another that was the focus. So one way to sort of wrap our heads around this is not something that was covered in the textbook, but just to sort of give this a little bit, these concepts, or rather Confucius's concepts, a little bit more of a sort of contemporary illustration. I'm going to have us look at the kind of thinking he had in mind through, or rather, we're going to be looking at what the decisions we make about, the things to do and the stuff to focus on. Two different ways that we could sort of model those decisions. And one of those models is it bears pretty close resemblance to the way that Aristotle was thinking about things. So in case I was confusing for you, I'm going to try saying it just one more time. So Aristotle, or rather Confucius, had a specific sort of model for decision making about what we should do in mind. And that model contrasts another model that is much more individualistic in nature. So the first model is one that I think that some of you might be familiar with, the individualistic model, often referred to as the prisoner's dilemma. So in general, what game theory does is it models different sorts of metrics for possible decisions that people might make in a situation. And for the most part, the way that the decisions are made, or rather, there are two ways that you can categorize a decision in how people, there are two different kinds of decisions that people can make when they're acting in combination. They're working in collaboration with one another. They can cooperate with the other party, or they could defect. Okay. And in the prisoner's dilemma, or the prisoner's dilemma works in the following way. So imagine, and there's a bunch of different ways that you could sort of like cash out what the situation would be here. But in general, it looks like something where you have two people who say were arrested for breaking the law, and they're both separately brought in to be questioned. And the possible outcomes for, you know, what they say, whether they admit to this crime they're accused of, or stay silent and refuse to cooperate with or refuse to give any information to the police, will, depending on what the other person does, impact the kind of punishment they'll receive. So you have these two people separately brought into questioning. Now, they both know that if both of them say nothing, they'll both get 1 year in prison. If one of them says nothing, but rats out the other one, then the person who said nothing gets 3 years, and the person who ratted out the other one walks away scot-free. Okay, so the way that and then that should correlate with what you're seeing on the screen here, right? So if we think of cooperation as being as remaining silent, and defecting as ratting out the other person, we can see sort of the cost benefit analysis, you might say, one might do in trying to determine which action it is they ought to take, right? What are the pluses and minuses, right? So if you run the risk, if you say nothing, you run the risk of getting 3 years in prison and the other person walking away scot-free. But you also would only get each 1 year in prison if you both said nothing, right? Now, it would be great, right, to maybe then just automatically want to rat out the other person, right? Because it seems like, well, running the risk of saying nothing, you know, like being loyal or whatever, that's the situation where I'm stuck doing 3 years in prison and that other person's walking off scot-free. But there's a catch, right? Because if you both rat one another out, then you both get 2 years in prison. Okay. So I think oftentimes people cite the prisoner's dilemma and assume that this is sort of like, we're always in a prisoner's dilemma with someone, right? Like if we don't try to screw up the other person is going to try to screw up what we're doing. It's very sort of like antagonistic type situation where the best case scenario for one person necessarily means that the other person gets the worst case scenario. So you could also think about this in terms of like, it's a zero sum game, right? So like whatever plus comes to one side, there's necessarily that necessarily takes away something from the other side, right? So you get +1, that means -1 for the other person. Okay. This isn't always how things work when we're working with people, though. I think this is a really important thing for us to just bear in mind throughout the class. And I think especially, I know many of you are business majors, because I think that oftentimes, our business dealings are depicted in this way where it's like a dog-eat-dog world out there and you got to make sure that you're not a sucker, right? Well, That's not always the way that it works. That's definitely not the way that Confucius thought it worked either. So there's another kind of dynamic that we're not always in this prisoner's dilemma when we're working with other people. When we're working with other people, sometimes we find ourselves in this what's called the stag hunt scenario, right? So this is the payoffs and the cost benefit analysis is much different here, in large part because if we realize our best case scenario in this situation, the best case scenario is actually, if one person gets it, that means the other person gets it. That both people have to agree to do the same thing in order for everybody to get the best possible outcome, right? So this is a lot different than the prisoner's dilemma because it was the opposite. In the prisoner's dilemma, in order for you to get the best possible outcome, that meant it was the zero-sum game. That meant that the other person necessarily had to go to prison for 3 years. In the stag hunt, it's a little bit different. So the scenario works in the following way. You decide to go hunting with someone, and you're putting together your hunting gear, and you have 2 different kinds of hunting gear. And I apologize for those of you who might be vegetarian or something like this. Please feel free to try to imagine a different scenario. In any case, you have 2 different kinds of hunting gear. You have hunting gear that you can target small game with, and you have hunting gear that you can target large game with, okay? So what kind of hunting gear do you pack? Now, and imagine that there's no communication between you and this other person you're going to go hunting with. If you pack the small hunting if you pack the gear to hunt the small game, that means that you can only go after the small game, which less meat, less nutritious, less tasty, but you don't need the other person in order to get it. However, if you pack your large game hunting gear and the other person does too, and together you go hunt the large game, that's the best case scenario. You have bigger, more meat, it's tastier, all those sorts of things. That is the stuff that you want, right? Okay, so now we can look at what the payoff distributions are in this scenario. So we have large game. We're going to give that just a value of 3. So that's best case scenario, right? Let's say that you get the large game together, that you get 3 weeks of food. Okay. Now, if you pack your big hunting game and the other person packs their small hunting game, so you go for the buck, you go for the stag, alone, you will not get it. You get 0. And the other person gets a significantly smaller payoff. They get something, but it's something that'll just feed them for a week. Now the same goes for you. And then if you both bring your small hunting game gear, you both eat for a day. You both get your rabbits, or you both eat for a week, right? So if you go to hunt the small game and the other person goes to hunt the big game, great. You eat for a week, they don't have anything. You both go for the small game, you both eat for a week, great. But you both go for the big game, and what happens? You both eat for 3 weeks. Much more desirable payoff, right? So in that situation, cooperation, both of the best possible outcome occurs, or the best possible outcome is only possible if you both cooperate together. So it's the opposite of a zero-sum game. If you win, that necessarily means that the other person wins. And it's that kind of attraction, that feeling, that importance it's for Confucius, valuing your relationships, putting that first, being attracted to that outcome. You will in sort of the way we think about it is that means that that's always the best possible outcome for you. The things that's best for your relationship, that's best for your family, these sorts of things. Those are the things that you feel have that 3 value, right? So going the selfish, dishonest route is sort of somebody who does that regularly, is someone who is attracted to attaining something that doesn't have any value, in a sense. So seeing the world and modeling our decisions with this stag hunt sort of mindset, Confucius would say, would be the way that we return to Li. It provides, viewing the world in that frame provides for harmony and order. And this is because, in large part, it brings gain and benefit, or performing Li brings gain and benefit to the system in which it's performed. So the way, and we're going to watch, we'll watch a couple of videos on this in a moment, but the way that Confucius understood Li, this return to Li, was a middle ground. It's a way to establish this middle ground between tyrannical brute force and then total reliance on individuals. So it's this way that we can organize with one another, right? So we like cooperate with one another, like we were seeing just in the previous stag hunt model, that doesn't force us to do it. There's not just one person on top dictating what everyone else needs to do, right? It's a collaborative, cooperative effort. But it's something that doesn't just happen based off of, pure individualistic self-interest. And a lot like Aristotle in some ways, this is it reflects an emphasis on finding a middle ground between excess and deficiency. So for Confucius, Junzi is the person who exists in this world of Li, we might say. And Junzi is going to have those three important qualities involved with being Junzi, and that's loyalty to the truth. I think in the text this was referred to as wholeheartedness. But the basic idea behind it is it's a specific kind of sense of loyalty to truth, but really being truthful with one another. So, one thing we might see in a business context would be if a superior is doing something that might be really overall, could create a lot of disharmony or chaos in the world, right? So I think that we could probably imagine some like pretty nefarious business scandals that we've heard about, right? And so like if you imagine a person in a situation where they're sort of watching all of this about to go down, being loyal to the truth means that you would speak up about it, right? So even like this is something that you could use to endorse some kind of whistleblowing or something like this, where you're gonna step up, you're gonna, you're going to try to do things that that maintain harmony and order. So it's that sort of loyalty to the truth, the kind of truth advocacy that maintains harmony and order that that Confucius felt was really important. And again, we have, another mean to be thinking about, another sort of balancing act to bear in mind, and the constant mean is something that is going to be discussed in the video shortly. But much of the time, it involves deliberation about balancing, your interest, not really your own interest, but really your duties and obligations to those who you're in relationships with. And then, so another quality of a zhengzi is going to be somebody who's good at practicing and maintaining that constant mean. And finally, the third quality that's really important is this quality of expediency, or quan, and where we can understand quan is a way, it's a lot like that notion of deliberation, that ability to look at things and see all of the different moving pieces and finding the best way to go about maintaining harmony and order, which necessarily is going to involve balancing your duties and obligations to those with whom you're in relationship with. Okay, so we're going to watch a video on this. Yeah, so here is a breakdown, a little bit more of a discussion about Li, as well as a few other features that I have yet to mention, and also I don't believe the text mentioned, just a more holistic general overview of how to be a zhengzi according to Confucius. All right.
Main idea. According to Confucius, in order to be a superiorly virtuous person, or a zhengzi, one should act with ren. Ren has been translated by scholars many different ways, including benevolence, empathy, true goodness, and altruism. In addition, a zhengzi is one who upholds the Chinese traditional values of zhong, or loyalty, xiao, or filial piety, li, or ritual propriety, or shu, or reciprocity. Contrary to the common belief of the time that only those of high social class could become a zhengzi, or a virtuous person, Confucius believed anyone could become one through self-cultivation and education. Ren, empathy. Ren is the highest virtue according to Confucius, and it is also one of the most difficult to translate. The components of the Chinese character can help reveal some of its meaning. On the left side of the Chinese character is the symbol for a person or human being, and on the right side is a symbol for the number 2. So express a fundamental Confucian belief that humans are interdependent, and that in order to be a truly good or virtuous human being, you must do so with other human beings. Ren can only be cultivated through relationships with other human beings and cannot be reached in seclusion. It is manifest through people's concrete behaviors toward other people. In other words, it is not enough to feel empathy or compassion toward others. Action is required. Mencius, a follower of Confucius, wrote that the concern one would feel for a child about to fall into a well is only part of Ren. For Ren to be truly realized in this situation, one would have to act to save the child. Ren requires a constant commitment to treating others with empathy, compassion, kindness, and respect. Quote, now the man of perfect virtue, wishing to be established himself, seeks also to establish others. Wishing to be enlarged himself, he seeks also to enlarge others. Analects 628. Zhong, Loyalty. Loyalty to others, according to a series of hierarchical relationships, is another critical guiding principle of Confucian ethics. Confucius believes that all people had proper roles and responsibilities based on their relationship to others that should dictate their behavior. By following their proper roles, relationships would be maintained, which is the highest priority for a stable society. For example, a ruler should be kind and giving to their people, and their subjects should be loyal in return. Overall, people should act according to their political loyalty first, then to their family and clan loyalties, and finally to friends and strangers. Note that those in senior positions in relationships are given responsibility to take care of those below them and to make decisions on their behalf with their best interests in mind. In return, those in junior positions of relationships treat them with respect, obedience, and loyalty. See image the 5 constant relationships for more. Shao, filial piety. This kind of hierarchical relational way of being is exemplified by Shao, or filial piety. Filial piety is sometimes translated as respect for one's parents or obedience to one's parents, but it is much more than that. Again, looking at Chinese character itself can help reveal some more of its meaning. The top portion of the character, Shao, is a symbol for old person, and underneath is a symbol representing a child. This embodies the idea that the younger person supports the older generation, but it is also reciprocal. The older generation protects, nurtures, and cares for the child from infancy, and therefore, the young person should respect, revere, and even perform ritual ceremonies of ancestor worship for them after their death. Filial piety is so important to Confucius because he believes the family to be a microcosm of a larger society. It is the family that teaches children about society, and he wanted them to internalize the belief that the world is inherently made up of hierarchical relationships. With each relationship, there is a clear set of roles and norms that exist, and that an ethical person is one who meets all the responsibilities as dictated by their role. And if parents succeeded in teaching children to be filial, the children would be able to apply that to the other relationships they had to friends, strangers, and most importantly, their government. If children were obedient to their parents, it meant they had learned to not defy their superiors and they would be obedient to their rulers. Therefore, if everyone acted according to their prescribed role, society would be harmonious. Once again, the ritual propriety. Confucius insisted on the need to return to traditional practices of rituals of all kinds, including those for marriage, funerals, ancestor worship, bowing, and using the appropriate form of addressing people. He believed that when people's outward actions reflected respect, their internal thoughts and feelings would be reshaped to reflect respect as well. Their ritual propriety would then set an example for others to follow, and the whole society could be transformed. He did say, however, that the ritual behavior must be engaged in sincerity and with genuine feeling for it to have any impact. Shoot, reciprocity. Below is an excerpt on reciprocity from page 30 of the Philosophy Handbook by Gregory Beauchamp. Confucius was a humanist in the sense that he focused mainly on practical human concerns and very little about spiritual matters or the ultimate nature of reality. The core of his teaching deals with questions of ethics and politics. With respect to ethics, Confucius was a thinker far ahead of his time. One example of this was his doctrine of reciprocity, or shu. It is said that one day Confucius' disciple, Tse Kung, asked, "Is there one single word that can serve as a principle of conduct for life?" Confucius replied, "Perhaps the word reciprocity will do. Do not do unto others what you do not want others to do unto you." This is one of the earliest forms of what is now called the Golden Rule. Most religions have some form or another of the rule. Jesus offers perhaps the most familiar version: always treat others as you want to be treated, Matthew 7:12. Confucius expressed essentially the same insight 5 centuries earlier, though he phrased the rule negatively: do not do unto others, whereas Jesus stated it positively. The golden rule may or may not be the most fundamental rule of morality, but it certainly captures something very basic to the moral life. It rules out any kind of irrational, special pleading of the form, quote, it's okay for me to do X, but it is not for anyone else to do it.
All right. So we can stop that there. I know that the video is a little awkward at moments, but those are a lot of pretty dense concepts. And despite some of the awkward moments and rhythm, perhaps, the person who made the video does a really great job explaining those basic concepts. Arguably a much better job than the textbook did. So I wanted to make sure that we're at least familiar with these different features of Confucius's view, because it's a really rich worldview, right? There's so many different pieces involved. It's very what one might call holistic. Again, I just wanted to emphasize that, this place where Confucius begins with the family is a really important place for us to, or it's a really important feature of his account, rather, for us to keep in mind. And that's, right. What I wanted to mention was that whichever point we start at, right? So there are those five different characteristics Zhengzi has, or in order to be a Zhengzi, you have to be capable of doing these 5 different things. At any given point, we will be able to tie back any one of those things to the family. And relationship with others, how everything is, it's those, if we start with those relationships in order to define what the good is, what virtuous behavior is. And again, this contrasts Aristotle, right? Because for Aristotle, he was looking at the purpose of individuals. And you might say Confucius was looking at the purpose of relationship. And you end up getting some different answers about what the right thing to do is, largely because you could imagine a person in a situation, say, who is being asked to do something that compromises the safety or the well-being of their family. So you could imagine a situation where the answer that the answer that Confucius would give to the moral issue that I brought up earlier when I was talking about Aristotle, someone gossiping about your family, right? I think that we could imagine a bunch of different ways that Confucius would argue we ought to respond to people that are spreading lies about our family, things that are going to, in a lot of ways could hold the potential for creating a lot of upheaval and threaten harmony, right? And balance. While we could imagine the application of Aristotle's ethics sort of guiding us to take some kind of middle ground and just letting it go, Confucius is going to give us a much different answer. So there are places where there's some pretty important differences between the two in terms of what exactly a virtuous person is attracted to. It's gonna depend depending on which moral framework, which moral theory you're applying. And the concerns that Confucius had too, specifically this concern that he had with anarchy, and anarchy on the one hand, and tyrannical force on the other, was born from like these political upheavals that were going on in China. And from where Aristotle was starting, the political climate was just a lot different. And I think that taking into considerations just the difference in those historical contexts, we might understand why, Aristotle ended up on the one hand focusing on the individual, and you had Confucius placing the locus on family. With those, now that we've talked about some of those differences, I think the best thing that we can probably take away from this part of the discussion, or this part of the course, is thinking about how certain similarities between the two theories could apply to more contemporary business settings, right? So for both of them, they argued that your personal and professional life are integrated. That means that you can't act one way at home and another way in public. You are either a virtuous person, you're sort of attracted to the good things, or you're not. And that most certainly is not ideology or mindset that we see now, right, in contemporary business settings. So much of various forms of egregious behavior, right, our businesses will hide behind the appearance of something that looks okay. One really good example, I don't know how many of you are following a scandal within the NFL, the National Football League, at the moment, but a well-known, tenured, decorated coach, Brian Flores, has come forward and is filing a lawsuit against the NFL for systematic discrimination against Black coaches and players as well, but most specifically coaches. And one of the things that the lawsuit focuses on is this longstanding history of not hiring or promoting Black employees or Black people into these coaching positions. And something that the NFL has really hid behind to avoid these kinds of allegations is something that they implemented, I think it was maybe 20 or 30 years ago, called the Rooney Rule, which essentially ensured that anytime any team was looking for a coach, they would be sure to interview. I think the language is saying minority groups, which is a little ridiculous if you think about it, considering that, they're often pulling people to be coaches. They're pulling people who are previously players, football players, professional football players, to be coaches, and 70% of players are Black. So they're clearly not a minority there, but it's in general, that rule is meant to sort of say, hey, look, we're actively combating discrimination. And what the lawsuit is showing is that there's this longstanding history of that not actually going on. So this is a really great place where we want to employ this general shared attitude between both Confucius and Aristotle, right? Because they both felt that the personal and professional are integrated. What you do in public needs to match what you do behind the scenes. You can't be supporting something like the Rooney Rule, right, and not actually actively fighting discrimination behind the scenes. So that is a great sort of way of thinking to apply in situations where businesses are sort of just gesturing at fighting various kinds of discrimination versus actually doing anything to combat it. So another point that both philosophers agreed on is that are essentially the means by which a person becomes virtuous, right? So it's all about education and upbringing and things like this. The video on Aristotle very much rightly pointed out that, sort of according to what his ideal setting was for how this education worked, it was a very specific group of people that were ultimately even capable of being virtuous. Well, that's most certainly a problem. And I think, when we run into issues like that in someone's philosophy, it's really good to look at what they're saying on the whole, look at all the stuff they've said and go, okay, is there a problem? Is this a common thread throughout all of the things that they're saying? Unfortunately, since this class isn't just a class dedicated to Aristotle's ethics, we don't have the space to do that here. So instead, what we'll do is we're just going to focus on, so I'm leaving it open. Maybe Aristotle is totally flawed, but there is one piece that we can pick out that does seem to be pretty useful when we're thinking about business ethics, and that is a lack of concern with what we might call benefit, and simply a focus or a concern with habitualizing ourselves in doing what's right. So what I was saying earlier, where, like many of you have talked about interest in psychology, these sorts of things, we see that we can habituate ourselves. We can sometimes learn to develop habits by sort of reasoning our way into, well, I should be enjoying these sorts of things, right? Like getting up early in the morning, if that's something that you need to do, or making sure to drink enough water, or maybe not watching so much TV and reading a book instead, right? We can sort of force ourselves to do certain things sometimes, and then all of a sudden we just find that we're in the habit of doing it, and it feels really, really good. So both Confucius and Aristotle agreed that developing those kinds of habits, those kinds of attractions towards virtuous behavior, ultimately is what makes you a virtuous person. Simply doing the things, maybe because somebody told you to do it, right? That's not enough. For instance, if there is a rule at your job or your school or something like this saying, don't do X or do Y this way, and you do it just because you're following the rule. For both philosophers, that couldn't make you a virtuous person. You had to be attracted to doing the virtuous thing in order to be a virtuous person. And for both philosophers, having those kinds of attractions were necessary in order to determine what the right thing to do next was. So essentially, the thinking is sure, anybody could do the right thing on accident, but you have to understand why, and you have to habituate yourself to be attracted to the things that are ultimately the right thing to do. So one thing that I'll leave us on is sort of what we might call a case study on our just intuitive attitudes towards hypocrisy, right? So a hypocrite would be someone who is telling everybody else to do one thing and then turns around and goes and does the exact opposite, right? So if you want to take a moment, think about an example where you've seen someone do that. I think that the world is just ripe with them, right? I'm sure down to professors telling you to do certain things in certain ways, and then all of a sudden you see that they're not doing things in those ways, right? That sort of frustration that we feel with a person, like, hey, well, you have this rule. Maybe you recognize that's a really great rule, right? Speaking to everyone at your job in a respectful manner, okay? Right? Like we can all probably get behind that kind of rule in general. Now, when the person who's implementing that rule, say a manager or something, or boss or something like this, and then they start behaving in the opposite way, they speak really disrespectfully, right? There's something that's extra frustrating about them maybe setting the rule of the right thing to do and then not seeming to have any idea about how to go about following it. So it's in those kinds of frustrations too that we also see some of the intuitive thinking behind both Aristotle and Confucius's respective virtue ethics. So that's going to do it for this lecture. And I thank everyone for sticking with me, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day.